It's Angela with Broadhead Memorial Public Library, back with another episode of Have You Heard? I hope you had a fantastic weekend, and we are continuing to read more of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIHM. So last week when we left off on Friday, Mrs. Frisby and Jeremy the Crow had gone to see the wise owl, and he told Mrs. Frisby, after finding out who her husband was, to go see the rats in the rose bush. So that's where we left out. Let's find out what happens next. The next chapter is called In the Rose Bush. When Mrs. Frisby got home, Teresa, Martin, and Cynthia were eating supper, as she had told them to do if it got dark before she returned. Coming silently down the tunnel, she could hear them talking in the room below, and she paused a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. Obviously, Cynthia had been worrying, and Teresa was assuring her. "She couldn't have got back sooner than this, Cinny. Don't you remember? The crow said it was a mile to the tree. It might be even further." "Yes, but crows fly so fast." "But if he went 2 miles up," that was Martin, "it would be 3 miles altogether." "6, said Teresa. 2 up, 2 down, and 1 to get there and 1 to get back." "That's right. No wonder she isn't back yet." "But what about the owl? You know how owls are." "It was still light when they got here. He couldn't see." "But it's dark now," said Cynthia. "Oh, I wish she'd come back. I'm scared." "Not so loud," Teresa said. Timothy will hear." "I'm home," called Mrs. Frisby, hurrying the rest of the way down. And now it appeared that they had all been worried, for they had ran to her, and even Martin, who ordinarily avoided such displays, threw his arms around her. "Oh, Mother," cried Cynthia, near tears, "I was so worried." "Poor Cynthia, it's all right." "How high did you fly?" asked Martin, recovering quickly. "High enough so the trees looked like bushes, and the garden like a postcard, and the river like a snake." "Did you see the owl? What did he say?" "I saw him. Later I'll tell you about it. First I went to see Timothy. How is he? Why didn't you move his bed out here?" Teresa said, "I wanted to, but he said he'd rather stay in the bedroom. I think he's feeling worse again." But when Mrs. Frisby went to see him, she found him sitting up, and his forehead felt not at all feverish. "I'm all right," he said. "I stayed in here because I wanted to think about something." "Think about what?" "About moving day." "Moving day? But why? What about it?" Had he, after all, overheard her talking to the others? Heard about her flight to the owl? But no, he was explaining. "I haven't been outdoors since I got sick, so I don't know what it's like. I mean the weather. But today, this afternoon, I noticed something." "What was that?" "A smell in the air. A warm, wet smell. If you sniff, you can still smell it, though it's not so strong now." Mrs. Frisby had noticed this, of course, both indoors and out. "It's the smell of frost melting," Timothy went on. "I remember it from last year, and after that it wasn't long until we moved. Mother, when are we going to move this year?" "Oh, not for a long time yet." Mrs. Frisby tried to sound as casual as she could. "It's still much too cold, too early to think about it." "I have to think about it," said Timothy. He sounded serious, but calm and unworried, "because if it comes too soon, I don't know if I can go. I tried walking a little bit today in here when the others were outside." "Timothy, you were supposed to stay in bed. You'll make yourself sick again." I know, but I had to find out, and I didn't walk much. I couldn't. I only went a few steps, and I got so dizzy I had to lie down again." "Of course you did. You haven't really recovered yet." "I guess I haven't. That's why I wanted to think." "Timothy, you must not worry about it. That will only make you worse." "I'm not worried at all. I thought I would be, but I'm not. Or maybe I think I should be, but I can't. What I really think about is how nice it is out there in the summer beside the brook, and it's true, I want to go, but I'm not scared. I was afraid you might be, or that you might think I was. That's really what I wanted to tell you. I'm just going to wait and see what happens, so you shouldn't worry about it either." Mrs. Frisby realized that he had somehow switched their positions. He had seen the danger he was in, guessed somehow that moving day was near, and that he was very likely to die. And yet here he was, reassuring her. She wanted to tell him about the owl and the rats, tell him that something still might be done. But she decided she had better not. She did not really know if they would help. It would be better to wait until she had seen them. So instead she said rather lamely, "Timothy, don't think about it any more. When the time comes, we'll see how you are, and then decide what to do." The next morning at daybreak, she went to see the rats. She had never been in the rosebush before, never even really close to it. And now, the nearer she got, the more nervous she became. No one had ever told her, nor, as far as she knew, told any of the other animals to keep away from it. It was just something one knew. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm kept to themselves. One did not prowl in their domain. She had, before coming out of the garden, looked around carefully to be sure Dragon was nowhere in sight. But even Dragon, though he would chase a rat up to the edge of the bush, would not follow him in. The thorns, of course, helped to discourage trespassers. Mrs. Frisby had never realized until that moment, standing next to it, how very big the bush was, how dense and how incredibly thorny. It was bigger than the tractor shed, and its branches were so densely intertwined that, as small as she was, Mrs. Frisby could find no easy way to crawl into it, though she walked all the way around it looking. She remembered approximately where she had seen the rats go in, and she studied that part of the bush carefully. How had they done it? Then she saw that on one branch, close to the ground, the thorns had been scraped off, and about a half-inch of it, just big enough for a handhold, was worn smooth. She put her hand on this and pushed timidly. The branch yielded easily, rather like a swinging door, and behind it she saw a trail, a sort of tunnel through the bush, wide enough so that she could walk into it without touching thorns on either side. When she went forward, she released the branch, and it swung back silently into place behind her. She was inside the bush, and it was dark. She walked forward, peering into the dimness and following the small trail which wound in a curving course toward the center of the bush, its earthen floor packed firm by the pressure of small feet. Then, straight ahead of her, she saw the entrance. What had she expected? A round hole in the dirt, most likely, but certainly nothing like what she saw. First, a sizable clearing, about 5 feet across, had been cut from the center of the bush. Branches overhead had been cleared away, too, not quite to the top of the bush, but almost, so that the sunlight filtered through easily, and soft moss grew on the ground. In the middle of this bright green cave rose a small mound, 8 inches tall, and in it, each end of which was anchored an arched entrance, neatly lined in stone, like a small doorway without any door. Behind the entrance, a tunnel, its floor also lined with stones, led backward and downward. Beside the entrance, looking at her with dark, unblinking eyes, stood the biggest rat she had ever seen. And here's a picture of Mrs. Frisby, who's here, and the rat by the entrance. All right, the next chapter is called Brutus. "Stop where you are," said the rat. "How did you get in here?" "I walked in," said Mrs. Frisby, keeping her voice calm with an effort. "I found a branch with the thorns smoothed off. I pushed it back and found—" "I know," said the rat rather rudely. "And now walk out again. You aren't allowed in here." He moved a few inches toward her, placing himself between her and the entrance. She noticed how powerful his muscles looked under his glossy coat. He would almost be a match for Dragon. Almost, but not quite. Go on, he repeated. But I have a reason. I don't care what you have. Go away. You're small. I wouldn't want to hurt you. Are you Justin? Mrs. Frisby inched back as the rat inched forward. I'm Brutus. Justin's not here. That was reasonably obvious, Mrs. Frisby thought. The rat named Brutus added, You know Justin? No, said Mrs. Frisby. That is, not exactly. If you don't know him, how do you know his name? Brutus sounded puzzled, and Mrs. Frisby observed that although he was greatly oversized and muscular, his eyes were bright enough, he looked very young. It was told to me by my friend. Can I see him? Justin? No. He's at a meeting. I'm taking his place. They're all at a meeting but me. Bad luck, thought Mrs. Frisby. He's a substitute. She said, Then I'll wait for him. No, said Brutus. You can't stay here. I've got orders. Now go, or I'll have to take you out myself. He moved forward again. My name, said the mouse desperately, is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. I went to see Nicodemus. It did not work. I don't care what your name is, and you can't see Nicodemus, that's sure. Brutus now looked both puzzled and annoyed. Move on, and be quick. All right, said Mrs. Frisby. You needn't force me. I'll go. She turned slowly and walked back the way she had come. She felt like crying, after coming all this way, after flying to see the owl, to be turned back so abruptly at the end. She thought as she walked into the darker part of the bush, maybe she could just wait for an hour or so until the meeting, what kind of meeting could it be, was over, and then go back, and perhaps the rat named Justin would be at the entrance then. But would Justin pay any more attention to her than Brutus had done? She had a feeling that he would. But when she stopped, she heard footsteps behind her. She looked back and saw that Brutus was following her, so she started again, hurrying to keep out of his sight. After a while, she paused again and listened. This time there was no sound. He must have gone back to his post. She sat down on the ground. Then, ahead of her, in the direction of the place where she had entered the bush, she heard a rustle, a faint scraping noise. It was the branch she had pushed to get in. Someone else was moving it. Someone was coming in, walking along the narrow path toward her. It must be another rat. Suddenly she was terrified. What would he do, meeting her unexpectedly in this dimness? She shrank to one side as close as she could get to the wall of thorns, hoping that whoever it was might go on past her, not seeing her. Then he came around the curve, and she saw him. It was her old friend, Mr. Ages, the white mouse. He was moving extremely slowly, and she realized that he was limping badly. One of his legs was injured. It was wrapped up in splints and bandaged. Mr. Ages, she called softly. It's Mrs. Frisby. Who? He peered into the shadow. I can't see you. Mrs. Frisby. She moved into the middle of the path in front of him. Why, so it is, Mrs. Frisby. How do you do? He sounded cordial enough, but he was startled. I didn't know that you... How do you happen to be in here? It's a long story. Then tell it to me while I rest. I'm supposed to be at a meeting, but I'm already late, and a few minutes more won't matter. As you can see, I had a bad fall and broke my ankle. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it doesn't hurt. It is mending, but I can walk only slowly and need to rest frequently. He sat down with a sigh. Now tell me what you're doing in the rat's bush. Mrs. Frisby, who was wondering the same thing about him, told him as briefly as she could about Timothy, Jeremy, the owl, and Brutus. Mr. Ages listened in silence, interrupting only once. You went into the owl's tree? Yes, but I was afraid. I should think so. That took courage. I had to do it. When she had finished her story, Mr. Ages sat quietly for a minute, considering it. Poor Timothy, he said at last. I should have thought of that myself. But, of course, when I gave you the medicine, the weather had not yet turned warm. Then I fell and broke my leg, and I forgot all about it. He stood up. I think, he said, that you should come with me back to the entrance. But I can't. Brutus will still be there. Mrs. Frisby, having done all that you have done, you are not going to give up now. I'll talk to Brutus. You know him? I have known him since he was born. He's not very old, you know. I think he will do what I ask. From the way he said this, Mrs. Frisby could tell that he did not merely think it. He knew it. But how? All right, she said doubtfully. I'll try again. But I don't understand. How do you know Brutus? We had better move along. They started back toward the entrance at Mr. Age's slow, limping pace. As to how I know Brutus, that's a much longer story than yours, and I doubt that I am the one to tell it to you. It is for Nicodemus to say. But I will tell you this. If we go in the entrance, as we will, if you are to ask for help, you must promise that you will never tell anyone anything at all about what you see and hear. I'll promise, said Mrs. Frisby. Again, she thought she had no choice. The owl told me that, too. When they approached the entrance again, Mrs. Frisby saw that Brutus stood at his post as before, but that another rat had joined him. Two of them, she thought. I hope Mr. Ages knows them both. The new rat saw them coming. He looked alert, dark gray in color, and extraordinarily handsome, though not so huge as Brutus. Mr. Ages, he said, how's the leg? Better, but it will be a while before I can run again. Justin, said Brutus, staring at Mrs. Frisby. There she is. That's the one I was telling you about. Is she now? Justin looked at her casually. He did not sound particularly alarmed. Mrs. Frisby, said Mr. Ages formally, may I present my friends Justin and Brutus? How do you do? Brutus sounded doubtful. Mrs. Frisby? Said Justin. Not Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby, said Mr. Ages, a widow, as you know. Madame, said Justin, bowing politely, it is an honor to meet you. Brutus now looked astonished. You both know her? Who is she? Brutus, said Mr. Ages gently, don't you remember Mr. Jonathan? Brutus wrinkled his brow. Mr. Jonathan, you mean the one dragon? Yes, said Justin quickly. And this is Mrs. Jonathan. Oh, said Brutus. Then to Mrs. Frisby, why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have chased you off. Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I did try, but it doesn't matter. No, said Mr. Ages, because on the way out she met me coming in. She needs to talk to Nicodemus, and quickly. Brutus looked doubtful again. Nicodemus? But can she? I mean, how about the rules? What about the plan? Mr. Ages said, that has been taken care of. She has promised secrecy, and she is to be completely trusted. That I, myself, guarantee. After all, consider who she is. As an afterthought, he added, and who her children are. Who am I, then? Mrs. Frisby asked herself in wonder. I suppose that, too, will have to come from Nicodemus. Mr. Ages said to Justin, what about the meeting? It can't be over already. It was temporarily adjourned, said Justin, to wait for you. In fact, I came to find you. Then I suppose we had better go in. Justin led the way through the arched entrance, with Mrs. Frisby and Mr. Ages following. Brutus remained outside at his post. All right, well, we are going to stop there for today. If you are participating in our summer reading program, you can go ahead and write down 20 minutes of listening time. We will be back we'll be back tomorrow with more from Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim. Before I go, I do want to thank Athenaeum Books for Young Readers for allowing us to share the story for you. I forgot to do that at the beginning. All right, well, I hope to see you more tomorrow. Everyone have a great day. Bye.